Welcome everyone to another tutorial from Code Slice. So what we're going to be looking at in this tutorial, we will be looking at some Python basics. So these Python basics are very important to understand, especially if you are working with Kiwi, Pygame, or Tkinter. The reason why this is very important is because these frameworks, they work with Python. So the more you know your basic Python, or the more you know Python, the more actually you are better at your creativity when working with various frameworks. All right. So specifically, we will start looking at the types of data you get. All right. So in Python, there's quite a number of types of data that you get, but we are only going to be looking at three, which is your numbers. So the numbers, they can be there's two types of numbers that you get. You get your integers, or you get your float type of numbers. All right, and then you also get your strings. So that is what we're going to be looking at. Yes, so I think let's start. So we can start with your integers. So integers, they are just your whole numbers, like 1, 2, 3, or even huge numbers. They don't have like a decimal point. All right. And then when it comes to like your float type of numbers, they have like a decimal point. So numbers like 1 point, 1 point something, 3 point something, 0 point something, those are your float kind of numbers. All right. And then of course you have your strings, which are always enclosed by quotation marks. All right. Yeah. So Python, there is a method in Python for you to check what type of data like your values are, or your variables are. And how you do this, simply you just use the word type. All right. So let's suppose we have a number 120. All right. So in order to check what kind of um what kind of data we are dealing with, or what kind of number we are dealing with, we can just do as follows. So type, then we can put that number in brackets. All right. So as you can see, it returns class int. So int here means integer. All right. Yes. Let's try and maybe another value. Maybe let's say 70. As you can see, this tells us that 70 is actually an integer. All right. But what if the number was 70.0? All right. Let's see what we get. 70.0. So when we run that, we can see that it returns a float. All right, it's a float. All right, because there's a decimal point. So whenever there's a decimal point, then it's a float. All right. So one of the things that we like to do when it comes to numbers, is sort of like add numbers together, multiply or divide, doing your calculations and stuff. So it's very important to understand these different types of numbers, especially if you're going to be working on an app such as a calculator and so forth. Because what you'd want to do is you'd want to like add, let's say 70, plus 3.4, it will give you a certain number. And in this case, if you look at the answer, 73.4, it's a float, all right, because it has a decimal point. All right. Yeah, so it's very important to understand all of these things. And then of course the third type of data that you get is your string. A string. All right. So a string is basically enclosed by quotation marks. All right. So suppose you have the number 70 but in quotation marks. Let's see what it is. So type in quotation marks 70. As you can see, it returns a string. Why? Your strings are always enclosed by quotation marks. All right. Yes. And also, let's just test this theory out as well. So what if we say type, right? And then we put like just some random letters or words. When we run that, what happens? We get an error, all right, because your strings have to be within these quotation marks. All right, so let's try maybe put a word there. Like, what about the in quotation marks, the type? It's a string. All right. Yes. So now, why is knowing this very important? So knowing this is very important because if you are working with some GUI, like for instance in the Kiwi framework, I have some examples here. Let me just close this. I actually have an example here. All right, so I'm just gonna run this just to explain. All right, so keep in mind that even though I'm using Kiwi as an example, but actually it's the same for Pygame and Tkinter. It's pretty much the same. All right, so in Kiwi, if you look at what we have here, we have a text input. This is what we call a text input. All right, and then we also have like your label here and your button. All right, so in order for you, the values that are handled by the text input or your label and so forth, all of these values, they are a sort of strings in a way. As you can see here, our label, it's the text dates enclosed by these quotation marks because it's string values. It's the same with the text input. So if you want to, let's say, make a calculator, you can't go and just just collect the values directly from the label. You need to convert them first. And that is what I am actually doing in this app here. All right, so as you can see here, there's an input box. So this is where I'm going to put the number. Like, let's say I can put the number 12. All right, so this is defined here. This is sort of like the input text. All right, the input text. So in order for me to make calculations, I need to convert that input value, all right, into either a float or an integer. Because floats and integers, you can sort of add them together or subtract them or do all sort of, of these calculations on them. But with strings, you cannot do so. Just to show you what I mean by that, strings cannot sort of add or subtract each other and stuff like that. So once again, I'm opening the terminal. So suppose you have a string, right? And the string is 5, right? And you want to add 5 plus 3. All right, so what's going to happen now? All right, what happens now is that the strings, instead of them adding and becoming 8, they just attach each other. All right, yeah, so which means you can't really use strings to calculate values. Even if you try to multiply and stuff, it doesn't really like give you the desired values. All right, let's try that. As you can see, you are even getting like an error. All right, yes. So in order for you to calculate values, you need to convert your strings into your integers or your float. All right, so going back to the app, so that's what I'm doing. Let me just run that again. Yeah, so what's happening here is that when you input a value, right, when you input that value, what happens is that, let's say you have 5, that value is then converted into a float. Here, as you can see, it's converted into a float. All right, and it's also converted into an integer. All right, yes, and then once that value is converted, what happens to it? It is calculated. Because remember, in order for you to calculate values, you can only calculate floats, your floats and your integers. You can add them, multiply them, whatever you want to do, but they have to be either float or integer. All right, and that's what we're doing here. All right, Yes, and after we've calculated, then what do? We then convert once again the answer that we got into a string so that we can return it to our label or text input or whatever widget you're going to be using. So this is very, very important. If you don't convert it to a string, it's going to be an error. You're going to get an error because your labels, your text inputs, all of these, they work with strings, not integers or floats. So you have to convert it. All right. Yes. So once it's converted, then we are able to display the results. So let's go ahead and calculate. There we go. As you can see, we input 5. The 5 was multiplied by 4 to give 20. All right. But of course, we converted 1 into a float. That's why it's 20.0. A float always has a decimal point. And then the other one is just plain 20. All right. Because it's an integer. All right. Yeah, so that's something that's very important for you to know. Once again, it's the same for Pygame, it's the same for Tkinter. So this doesn't necessarily work only for Kiwi. So I'm just using for Kiwi for demonstrative purposes only. All right. Another thing that I wanted to just mention when it comes to numbers and stuff. So let's say you have a float, right? 45.12345, you know, like this. So you have it's like it has so many decimal points or numbers after the decimal point or whatever you want to call it, but you don't want it to have so many decimal points, but maybe you just want it to be, you know, 45.1 or just 45.2 instead of having these huge long numbers. How do you do that? You use round. All right, so there is this round function that you can sort of use in Python, which is quite amazing. So what you do is the first thing you put is basically the number that you have. In this case, it's 45, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5. All right, and then you put a comma, and then how many decimal points you want. So if I just want it to be up to 1 decimal point, then I can just put a number 1 there. All right, and then if I run that, it becomes 45.1. all right, so suppose maybe we don't want it to be 45.1, but maybe we want it to be to 2 decimal points, so we can just put a 2 there. All right, now it's going to be 45.12. Also very, very important, especially if you're working with labels and stuff, you want to control like how much is displayed and things like that. So this is something very key, very important to know. Yes. And maybe one more thing that I can also touch. I know there's like usually a lot of questions regarding this. So when it comes to you know, to when you're programming stuff, you'll also encounter these kind of square brackets. All right, so these square brackets, they are actually used to define a list or to create a list. All right, yes, now let me explain. So for instance, if you say, let's create a new list. All right, so what we're doing here now is that we are defining a new list. So to define a list, we use these square brackets. All right, so in that list we can put whatever, let's say what. All right, remember strings must always be in quotation marks. Maybe we can put a value there as well. Maybe let's also put a float there as well. All right, so now let's go on and so now we have our list. So now let's go on and print that. Print new list. All right, as you can see, when you print, you get that list because now you have defined that list. All right, yeah, so basically those square brackets, it means you are creating a list. All right, yes, and of course with lists, there's various things you can do with lists. In future tutorials, I will share more regarding what are the things you can do with lists, but here in this tutorial, I will not go into that. All right. Maybe one thing that you can also take note of is len. All right. So len is sort of used to count how many variables or characters or data do you find within the list. Like in our list, what do we have? We have a string, which is what? We have an integer 1, and then we have a float value, which is 2. All right. So ultimately, there's only three data that we have within this list. There's 3 items, basically. So if you use len, right, and then you put the list in brackets like this, so what it's going to do is it's going to return 3 because there's only 3 items or 3 variables that you have within your list. All right. Now len is not only used on lists, you can also use it on strings as well. It can sort of count how many characters you have. Like an example, let's say you have the word slice, right? Now, how many letters does slice have? You can use len to find the number of letters. All right, so it has 5 letters. All right, yeah, so these are some of the fundamentals that are very, very important for you to know. Remember, the more you know your fundamentals, the more you understand the Python itself, the Python language, the better you are when it comes to working with your Kiwi, Pygame, or your Tkinter or various Python frameworks. And from Code Slice, that's it. Have an amazing day.